6 months ago, I moved back to my grandfather's old land. The HOA president banged on my door at 7 a.m. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. Phones out, whispering my name. I stayed calm and asked her one simple question. Her face changed the second I mentioned property deeds. She laughed, but her hands were already shaking. What she didn't know would end her reign forever. My name is Grace Whitfield, though most of Fallow Creek still called me Grace Doyle, my ex-husband's name. I'd moved back into my late grandfather's farmhouse after the divorce, tired, broke, and hoping for quiet. I didn't expect a welcome committee with a clipboard and an attitude. The house sat on 11 acres my grandfather Walter had owned since before Meadow Hollow Estates existed. The subdivision had grown up around it decades later, streets curling like vines toward my porch. I figured I'd just live simply. I had no idea how loudly that would bother someone. Her name was Deborah Sinclair, president of the Meadow Hollow HOA for 11 straight years. She wore visors indoors, carried a laminated rulebook everywhere, and treated compliance like a religion. People said her word was closer to law than the actual town ordinances. Deborah measured lawns with an actual ruler. She once fined a widow for a birdbath that was unsanctioned. Nobody challenged her twice. The one time someone tried, their house went up for a bogus lien within a month. Word got around fast. Cross Deborah. Lose sleep. My grandfather had never joined the HOA because his land predated it by 40 years. He was grandfathered out, quite literally, and the paperwork sat quietly in an old filing cabinet in his study. I hadn't touched those files yet. I didn't know how much they mattered. The first week, Deborah left a flyer on my door. Welcome to Meadow Hollow. Enclosed, community guidelines. I skimmed it and set it aside. My grandfather's mailbox was hand-carved, a rooster on top. Apparently that alone violated 3 separate design codes according to her red pen notes. I assumed it was a misunderstanding. I called the HOA office, explained my parcel wasn't part of the association, and was met with dead silence. Then a clipped, "We'll have to verify that." The way she said it felt less like curiosity and more like a threat. 2 days later, a laminated notice appeared taped to my door. Mailbox violation. Remove within 5 days. No name. No signature. Just a stamped HOA seal. I peeled it off. Annoyed but not alarmed. I still believed reasonable people could sort this out with paperwork. My neighbor Ruth, 70-something with wind chimes older than me, warned me over the fence. "Honey, she doesn't do reasonable," Ruth said, glancing over her shoulder like Deborah might materialize from the hedges. She did something to the Alvarez family. They moved out crying. I asked what happened to the Alvarez family. Ruth just shook her head and changed the subject, suddenly very interested in her tomato plants. That silence unsettled me more than any story could have. Something had happened here before, and everyone was still too scared to say it aloud. I dug through my grandfather's study that weekend, hunting for the original land survey. Dust coated a metal box labeled Whitfield Parcel Legal. Inside were deeds, easement agreements, and a folder marked simply HOA correspondence. Do not discard. I set it aside, unread, exhausted from moving boxes. Deborah's husband, Ron, waved at me from his driveway one afternoon, friendly in a nervous sort of way. He seemed almost apologetic before Deborah even said anything. "She means well," he offered quietly. like a disclaimer he'd repeated many times. I wondered exactly what well meant to her. By week 3, Deborah started walking her dog past my house twice a day, always slowing near the fence line, always glancing toward my unmowed side lot. She never spoke. The way inspectors look at things they intend to write up eventually. I finally mowed the side lot on a Saturday. More for peace of mind than compliance. Deborah appeared within 20 minutes, clipboard in hand, measuring the height of my grass with a small ruler pulled from her fanny pack. "Getting there," she said. Getting there felt like a warning. That night I read through the HOA's community guidelines properly. 42 pages, including rules on flag size, holiday light wattage, and mailbox rooster ornaments apparently being a specific, named violation. I laughed at first. Listed on their official property roster. My address on their roster stopped my laughing cold. According to the HOA's records, my grandfather's land had been part of Meadow Hollow since 2003. That was impossible. And I had the original deed sitting 2 feet away from me. I called the county assessor's office the next morning. The kind woman on the phone confirmed what I already suspected. My parcel had never been annexed into the HOA. Whoever created that roster entry had either made an error or deliberately falsified official-looking community records. I wasn't sure which yet. I printed the assessor's confirmation and drove it straight to the HOA office, feeling oddly nervous walking into a building I didn't technically belong to. Deborah sat behind the front desk like a queen behind a moat. She barely glanced at my papers before sliding them back. "Our records are accurate," she said flatly, not even reading what I'd handed her. "The county makes mistakes constantly." I pointed out that the county mistake would be their own official assessor's database, not some clerical typo. She smiled thinly, said, unconvincingly. I left that meeting with a strange, sinking feeling. It wasn't just bureaucratic stubbornness. Deborah hadn't looked surprised by my claim at all. She'd looked prepared, like she'd rehearsed exactly that response before I ever walked through the door. Somebody had warned her I was coming. A week passed with no follow-up. Then a new letter arrived. This one from Meadow Hollow HOA Legal Committee, threatening a lien for unpaid dues dating back to 2003, the same fabricated year on their roster. The number attached was staggering, $14,600. Plus accruing interest. My stomach dropped reading it. I called a lawyer that same afternoon. A woman named Priya Anand who specialized in property disputes. She asked me to send everything. The roster printout, the assessor confirmation, my grandfather's original deed, and the lien letter. "This smells organized," she said carefully.
"Give me a..."
Priya called back 3 days later, her voice tighter than before. "Your grandfather's parcel has a recorded easement," she said, granting the HOA limited road access through his land, dated 1998, before the subdivision existed. I hadn't known that clause existed. Suddenly, everything felt more complicated than a simple mistake. The mailbox rooster incident finally boiled over on a Tuesday morning. I found it lying in the grass, snapped clean off. A fresh HOA notice taped where it used to sit, removed for non-compliance, community standards enforcement. No apology, no warning beyond the taped letter I'd ignored. I marched straight to Deborah's house, rooster fragment in hand, angrier than I'd been in years. She opened the door mid-sip of coffee, entirely unbothered. "We gave you notice," she said calmly. 5 days. Remember, I told her that wasn't her mailbox to touch. HOA member or not. "Everyone in Meadow Hollow follows the same rules," she said, stepping onto her porch like she owned the sidewalk too. "Special treatment isn't fair to your neighbors."
I reminded her.
Again, that I wasn't in her HOA. She smiled that same rehearsed smile. "We'll see about that." That evening, 3 of my neighbors showed up on my porch. Awkward and apologetic. Deborah had apparently sent a group text calling me difficult and non-compliant, suggesting the block organize a friendly conversation with me about community standards. Ruth was one of them, refusing to meet my eyes. "She said you're refusing to pay dues you owe." One neighbor, a man named Curtis, said carefully. I explained the roster discrepancy and the assessor's confirmation. Curtis frowned, clearly unsure who to believe, caught between years of Deborah's authority and the stranger who just moved back. Ruth finally spoke up after the others left. "The Alvarez family said something similar," she whispered. "About fake paperwork." Deborah told everyone they were behind on dues too. They left owing thousands they swore they never actually owed. My chest tightened. This wasn't new. I asked Ruth if the Alvarez family still lived in town, anywhere I could reach them. She shook her head slowly. They moved 3 states away. Wanted nothing more to do with this place. That felt less like relocation and more like fleeing something. I needed to find them. Priya tracked down a forwarding address for the Alvarez family through public records, and I sent a careful, respectful letter explaining my situation, asking if they'd be willing to share theirs. 2 weeks of silence followed. I assumed I'd hear nothing back. I was wrong. Eventually, but not yet. Meanwhile, the fake $14,600 lien notice escalated. A second letter arrived threatening to file with the county recorder's office within 30 days, which would cloud the title on my grandfather's land. Priya assured me it was baseless, but baseless claims still cost real money and real stress to fight. I started keeping a folder of my own, photos of every notice, timestamps, screenshots of the HOA's public roster before and after I complained, since I noticed entries quietly changing overnight. Someone was editing digital records in real time, clumsily trying to patch holes in a story that wasn't holding together. One evening I caught Deborah's assistant, a soft-spoken young man named Marcus, replacing a notice on my door instead of Deborah herself. He looked nervous, almost sick about it. "She told me to," he mumbled, before hurrying off. I wondered how many people around here felt the same trapped guilt. I tried being neighborly despite everything, hosting a small barbecue to meet people properly. Only 4 families came. Deborah, I later learned, had sent another group message warning residents that associating with a non-compliant property owner under active HOA review could jeopardize their own good standing. Fear was her currency. Curtis came anyway, quietly apologizing for the earlier confrontation. "She's done this before," he admitted over a burger, voice low like the fences had ears. "Nobody fights her because everyone's scared of liens, fines, or worse. She's on the county zoning board's advisory panel. People assume she has real power." That detail stuck with me, an advisory panel seat. It wasn't official authority, but it created the illusion of it. And illusions were apparently Deborah's specialty. I began to understand her strategy wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated intimidation, built carefully over a decade, brick by brick, fine by fine. I finally opened my grandfather's HOA correspondence folder that night, unable to put it off any longer. Inside were letters dating back 15 years, HOA requests for road easement renewals, all signed and returned by my grandfather, methodical and precise as ever. He'd kept meticulous records of every interaction. One letter, dated 3 years before he died, stood out immediately. My grandfather had formally revoked the road easement, citing repeated harassment by association representatives, and demanded the HOA cease all correspondence unless legally required. Attached was a certified mail receipt. The HOA had simply ignored his revocation entirely. If the easement had truly been revoked, the HOA's continued use of that access road for the past 3 years was unauthorized. I photographed everything and sent it straight to Priya. Her reply came within the hour. This changes things significantly. Don't confront her yet. Let me build this properly. Deborah, unaware of what I'd found, escalated anyway. A notice appeared demanding I restore original road access markers my grandfather had removed years earlier, threatening a $500 daily fine for obstruction. I almost laughed. Enforcing my own grandfather's documented legal decision. I didn't pay the fine. I sent Priya's formal response letter, citing the original easement revocation and certified mail receipt, demanding the HOA immediately cease referencing the road in any further correspondence.
Deborah's reply came fast and furious. A certified letter threatening legal action.
The absurdity was almost funny now. She was threatening to sue me over infrastructure that legally required my family's permission to exist at all. I started to feel something shift inside me. Less fear, more resolve. She'd built her power on assumptions nobody ever checked. I intended to check everything. That week, an unexpected email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. Elena Alvarez. I saw your letter, she wrote. We need to talk. Mistake. It was deliberate, and I have proof. My hands were shaking as I typed my reply. Elena and I spoke on the phone for nearly 2 hours. Her family had been threatened with the same fabricated back-due scheme, forced to pay $9,200 under duress to avoid a lien freezing their home sale. They'd been desperate to relocate for a sick relative, and Deborah had known it. She timed it perfectly, Elena said bitterly. She knew we couldn't fight it and move in time. We just paid to make it disappear. I asked if she'd kept records. She had everything, including a recorded phone call where an HOA staffer admitted the dues figure was estimated. Elena agreed to send copies of everything to Priya. Within days, a pattern emerged across at least 4 other households, all pressured with inflated or entirely fictional dues right before major life transitions. A sale, a move, a medical crisis. Deborah wasn't just controlling. She was financially predatory and precise. I started noticing Deborah's own house more closely during evening walks. A sunroom addition jutted off the back, clearly newer than the original structure, without the required HOA architectural review placard every other renovated home displayed. If her rules were truly sacred, she'd broken her own commandments first. I mentioned the sunroom to Curtis casually. His eyes widened. Close enough to check, he admitted. She keeps the backyard fenced. Dogs loose most days. Convenient. I thought that the one house never inspected belonged to the woman doing all the inspecting. Priya suggested filing a public records request for HOA architectural review approvals over the past 5 years. A completely legal, mundane administrative move. It would take weeks to process, but it would create an official paper trail. One Deborah couldn't quietly edit overnight the way she had the resident roster. While we waited on records, Deborah shifted tactics entirely. She stopped sending letters and started showing up in person. Always with a witness. Always recording our conversations on her phone. Presumably to build her own case that I was the unreasonable, difficult new neighbor causing community disruption. "You're upsetting people," she told me one morning. Phone visibly recording from her cardigan pocket. Threatening lawsuits. Spreading rumors about longtime residents. I hadn't spread a single rumor. I'd simply asked questions. But I recognized the strategy now. Control the narrative before anyone else could control it. I started recording our interactions too. Openly. Phone in hand. No pretense. Deborah's composure flickered for just a second. The first genuine crack I'd seen in weeks. "There's no need for that," she said, suddenly stiffer. I said I disagreed, and left it exactly there. The tension spread beyond just us two. At the next scheduled HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse, Deborah announced a special agenda item regarding non-compliant residents, without naming me directly, though everyone in the room turned to look. I sat in the back, calm, uninvited but unwilling to leave. She presented slides, actual slides, alleging I'd refused to pay dues, damaged shared infrastructure, and threatened legal action against the association without cause. Several neighbors murmured. I raised my hand and asked to speak. Deborah hesitated, clearly not expecting me to show up at all, let alone respond. "I'm not a member of this HOA," I said clearly, loud enough for the back rows. "My grandfather's land predates this subdivision, and county records confirm it. I have documentation." Deborah's smile tightened. "We can discuss this privately afterward," she said quickly, trying to steer the room away from me. "Privately hasn't worked so far," I said, and pulled out copies of the county assessor's confirmation, distributing them to nearby neighbors before Deborah could object. Whispers rippled through the room. For the first time, people weren't just looking at me with suspicion. Some were looking at her. Deborah adjourned the meeting early, visibly rattled, insisting procedural matters required further review before continuing discussion. As people filed out, Curtis caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Something had shifted in that room, even if nobody said it out loud yet. Ron approached me in the parking lot afterward, glancing back toward the clubhouse nervously. "She's not going to let this go," he warned quietly. "You should know she's called people before. Not just about fines. Over property lines and noise complaints that never made sense." I asked Ron directly why he stayed married to someone who operated this way. He looked genuinely tired. "It wasn't always like this," he said. "The HOA presidency changed her. Or maybe it just gave her permission to be who she already was." He walked away before I could respond further. That night I received an anonymous email with an attached document. Internal HOA meeting minutes from 3 years earlier, showing a vote to formally revoke my grandfather's land from any disputed roster listing. The vote had passed unanimously. Deborah had simply never updated the public records to reflect it. If the minutes were authentic, Deborah had knowingly kept my property on a false roster for years after an official vote said otherwise, generating fake dues notices the entire time. I forwarded the email straight to Priya, who confirmed the document's formatting matched genuine prior HOA meeting records exactly. Priya believed we now had enough for a formal complaint to the state's HOA Oversight Board, plus grounds for a civil suit regarding harassment and fraudulent billing. "This isn't just messy anymore," she said. "This is actionable." She sounds like someone who escalates when cornered. That warning proved accurate almost immediately. 2 days later, my car's tires were slashed in my own driveway overnight. No note, no camera footage from the street angle, nothing concrete. But the timing, right after the meeting confrontation, felt anything but coincidental. I filed a police report regardless. The responding officer, a calm, unhurried man named Officer Reyes, took my statement thoroughly, then paused. "This isn't the first call from this street," he mentioned. "We've had noise complaints, trespassing reports, all filed by a Deborah Sinclair, going back years. Some officers here know that name well." Officer Reyes's tone told me plenty without him needing to elaborate further. Deborah had a documented history of weaponizing emergency services against neighbors, a pattern local law enforcement apparently recognized but had limited grounds to formally address until something more substantial than repeated nuisance calls came along. I asked Reyes what something more substantial might look like. He shrugged carefully, professional but not unkind. "Fraud, harassment with evidence, property damage tied directly to a person. Build your case properly, and it stops being a neighbor dispute. It becomes something we can actually act on." Armed with that, I compiled everything meticulously. The fake roster, the ignored easement revocation, the Alvarez family's testimony, the leaked meeting minutes, Deborah's unpermitted sunroom, and now the slashed tires with suspicious timing. Priya organized it into a formal complaint packet, ready to file with the State Oversight Board. Before filing, Priya recommended one more step, a certified letter directly to Deborah and the full HOA board, outlining every discrepancy and formally demanding correction within 15 days. Giving her one last documented chance to resolve things quietly before we escalated publicly. Felt generous, given everything. Maybe too generous. The letter went out on a Thursday. By Saturday, Deborah had posted in the neighborhood's private social media group, without naming me directly, warning residents about individuals attempting to destabilize our community through baseless legal threats and manipulation of longtime neighbors. The post got dozens of supportive comments within hours. I read through the comments carefully, noting names, recognizing a pattern. People who'd never spoken to me directly were suddenly certain I was the villain in this story. Fear and misinformation traveled faster than truth ever could. I closed the app, took a breath, and reminded myself the paperwork didn't lie. Elena Alvarez, watching from 3 states away, messaged me that night. "She did the exact same thing to us," she wrote. "Turned the whole street against us before we even understood what was happening. Don't let her isolate you." That's always been step 1 of her playbook. I took Elena's advice seriously and reached out individually to a few neighbors I trusted most. Curtis, Ruth, and a young couple named the Parks who'd recently moved in and seemed less entrenched in old loyalties. I shared documents directly, quietly, letting facts speak louder than any social media post. Ruth read through everything at her kitchen table, glasses perched low, silent for a long stretch. Finally, she looked up. "I always wondered about the Alvarez situation," she admitted. "I just didn't want to believe someone I saw at church every Sunday could do something like that deliberately." The 15-day deadline in our letter arrived with no formal response from Deborah or the HOA board, only continued social media posturing and a fresh notice claiming my unauthorized fence repairs violated community aesthetics, despite the fence sitting entirely on my grandfather's private, non-HOA land. The pettiness was almost impressive. For a brief stretch, things went quiet, unnervingly so. No new notices, no confrontations, no group texts. I almost let myself relax, assuming Deborah had finally realized the documentation stacked against her. Priya warned me otherwise. "Quiet usually means regrouping," she said, "not surrendering." I used the lull to finally get my grandfather's land properly surveyed by an independent county-approved surveyor, establishing clear, undeniable boundary markers along every disputed line, including the old road easement area. The surveyor's report arrived a week later, precise and entirely consistent with the original 1970s deed. Ruth started visiting more often during that quiet stretch, bringing banana bread, staying longer than necessary, clearly needing to talk. She eventually admitted she'd been quietly documenting Deborah's overreach for years in a private notebook, too scared to say anything publicly, hoping someday someone braver would come along. I kept thinking, what if it's me next? Ruth confessed, hands wrapped around her coffee mug. The birdbath fine was just the beginning. She threatened my late husband's memorial bench once, said it violated setback rules. I asked if she'd share her notebook. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Ruth's notebook, spanning nearly 6 years, detailed dozens of incidents, selective enforcement, favoritism toward Deborah's inner circle, fines waived for allies and doubled for perceived enemies. It read less like community record-keeping and more like a ledger of quiet, calculated cruelty disguised as neighborhood order. Priya reviewed Ruth's notebook alongside everything else and grew visibly more confident. "This establishes intent and pattern," she said. "Courts and oversight boards care deeply about pattern. One bad decision is a mistake. 6 years of documented selective enforcement is something else entirely. Something entirely worth pursuing." The Parks, the young couple, offered something unexpected during this quiet period too. Their home security camera had captured footage of someone lingering near my driveway the night my tires were slashed, timestamp matching perfectly. The figure's build and gait looked distinctly, unmistakably familiar to anyone who knew Deborah. The footage wasn't clear enough for absolute facial identification, frustratingly grainy in the dark, but combined with everything else, it painted an increasingly damning picture. Priya flagged it as supplementary evidence, not a standalone proof, but another thread in an already thickening rope of accountability. I finally called Elena Alvarez back with an offer. Would she and her family be willing to formally submit a sworn statement to the State Oversight Board, detailing exactly what happened to them years earlier? After a long pause, Elena said yes. "It's time someone stopped her," she said quietly. With Elena's statement, Ruth's notebook, the leaked meeting minutes, the survey report, and my own documented harassment, Priya finalized our formal complaint to the State HOA Oversight Board, alongside a separate cease and desist demand regarding the fraudulent roster and unpermitted road easement usage. We filed everything on a Tuesday morning. The Oversight Board's process wasn't instant. Priya warned it could take 4 to 6 weeks for initial review. In the meantime, I kept living my ordinary life as best I could, tending my grandfather's garden, fixing the porch steps, trying to remember why I'd moved back here in the first place. The quiet lasted almost 3 weeks total before cracking entirely. Marcus, Deborah's nervous young assistant, showed up at my door unannounced one evening, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. "I need to tell you something," he said, voice barely above a whisper.
"But you can't say—"
Marcus revealed that Deborah had been quietly diverting a portion of HOA dues into a separate account for years, disguised as community improvement reserves that never funded any actual visible improvements. He'd seen the ledgers by accident during a filing mix-up and had been too afraid to report it until now. I asked Marcus why he was finally speaking up. He looked down at his shoes for a long moment. "Because of what happened to your tires," he admitted. "I think I know who did it. I've heard her talk about you like you're a problem that needs handling." It scared. Marcus agreed to speak with Priya directly, on record, protected as much as possible under whistleblower provisions. Priya explained carefully to him. His testimony, combined with the financial ledger discrepancies he described, added a potential embezzlement angle to what had already become a sprawling, serious case against Deborah. Priya requested formal HOA financial records through the same public disclosure channels, this time specifically targeting the Community Improvement Reserve account Marcus mentioned. HOA associations, even small ones, were legally required to maintain transparent financial disclosures to members, and eventually, reluctantly, to relevant oversight authorities investigating complaints. Deborah, apparently sensing the walls closing in, shifted tactics again, this time going directly to local media. A short segment aired on the regional news, painting her as a dedicated community leader, targeted by a disgruntled newcomer refusing to follow shared neighborhood standards. The framing stung more than I expected. Watching myself described that way on television felt surreal and unfair, especially knowing what I'd already uncovered. But I reminded myself, again, that paperwork didn't care about narratives or camera angles. Priya agreed, calm as ever. "Let her talk to reporters," she said.
"We'll let the evidence—"
The news segment backfired in an unexpected way. It caught the attention of a local investigative journalist named Farah Cole, who reached out to me directly for comment. I was cautious at first, but Priya suggested cooperating carefully, sharing only what was already part of our formal filed complaint. Farah dug deeper than the original segment had, contacting the Alvarez family independently, requesting HOA financial records herself, and interviewing several Meadow Hollow residents off the record. Slowly, a fuller, far less flattering picture of Deborah's decade-long presidency began forming outside of just my personal dispute with her. Meanwhile, Deborah escalated the fine campaign against me directly, issuing 3 separate notices in 1 week: overgrown hedges, an unauthorized garden shed my grandfather had built in 1994, and improperly stored firewood. Each notice cited increasingly obscure rulebook sections, clearly designed to overwhelm rather than address legitimate concerns. I stopped responding to individual notices entirely, per Priya's advice, letting them accumulate as evidence of escalating harassment rather than engaging point by point. Every notice she sends after our cease and desist strengthens our case, Priya reminded me. She's building our file for us at this point. Ron reached out again, this time by email rather than in person, clearly wary of being seen communicating with me. She's not sleeping, he wrote. She knows something's coming. I don't know what you found, but I think it's more than she expected anyone to ever uncover. I didn't reply to Ron directly, uncertain of his motives, but I forwarded the email to Priya for the record. She noted it carefully. Could be guilt, could be strategy, she said. Either way, it confirms she's aware the pressure is real, not imagined. That matters for our timeline. The Oversight Board's preliminary review came back sooner than expected. Just under 4 weeks. Enough concerning evidence existed to warrant a full formal investigation into Meadow Hollow HOA's roster practices, dues collection, and financial reserve handling. Deborah would be formally notified and required to respond within 30 days. News of the formal investigation spread through the neighborhood almost instantly, despite no public announcement yet, likely leaked by someone on the board itself. Deborah's social media posts turned defensive overnight, framing the investigation as a bureaucratic misunderstanding stirred up by a single disgruntled resident with a grudge. Curtis stopped by that evening, looking almost relieved. People are starting to talk differently now, he said. Not everyone, but enough. The Parks mentioned the security footage to a few others. Ruth's been quietly showing her notebook around too. It's like a dam starting to crack. I hadn't asked Ruth to share her notebook publicly, but I understood the impulse. 6 years of silent documentation deserved more than sitting in a kitchen drawer forever. Some cracks, once they start, take on a momentum entirely their own, regardless of how carefully anyone tried to control the outcome. Deborah requested an emergency HOA board meeting to address recent unfounded allegations, scheduling it for the following weekend. I received notice, technically not required since I wasn't a member, but Deborah apparently wanted the optics of transparency now that reporters were sniffing around her decade of quiet control. I attended anyway, again uninvited but unwilling to be silenced by technicalities. The clubhouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it, word having spread widely by then. Farrah Cole sat quietly near the back, notebook in hand, clearly there in a professional capacity rather than as a curious resident. Deborah opened the meeting composed, controlled, insisting the so-called investigation was procedural and would clear her name entirely once complete. She avoided directly addressing the fraudulent roster, the ignored easement revocation, or the diverted reserve funds, instead focusing heavily on my supposed pattern of hostility toward the association. A board member I hadn't met before, an older man named Gerald, unexpectedly interrupted her prepared remarks. "Deborah," he said carefully, "I'd like the board to see the reserve account statements you mentioned providing last month. I never actually received them." The room went noticeably, uncomfortably still. Deborah's composure flickered visibly for the first time in public. "I'll have Marcus send them after the meeting," she said quickly. Too quickly. Marcus, seated near the door, said nothing. His silence somehow louder than any denial could have been in that packed watching room. Gerald pressed further. mentioning he'd requested those same statements 3 separate times over the past 2 months without ever receiving a response. Another board member, a quiet woman named Patrice, added she'd noticed similar unanswered requests in her own email records. The dam Curtis mentioned was fully cracking now. Deborah adjourned the meeting abruptly, citing time constraints, despite it having run barely 20 minutes. As people filed out, murmuring louder than I'd ever heard them, Farah approached me quietly. "I think this story just got significantly bigger," she said.
Would you be willing to?
I agreed to the interview, carefully, with Priya's guidance on what I could discuss without compromising our ongoing legal complaint. Farah's piece, when it eventually published, wouldn't just be about a rooster mailbox or a disputed roster entry. It would be about years of quiet, systemic neighborhood exploitation. That night, an unmarked envelope appeared taped to my door. No HOA seal this time. No official letterhead at all. Inside was a single printed line. "Stop digging before someone gets hurt." No signature. No explanation. My hands went cold reading it, and I called Officer Reyes immediately. Officer Reyes took the note seriously, bagging it for potential evidence, noting it alongside the earlier slashed tires and now established pattern of escalating intimidation. "This moves things forward on our end too," he said grimly.
Threats like this aren't something we can treat.
Priya escalated our filing immediately upon hearing about the threatening note, adding it as an exhibit and formally requesting the Oversight Board expedite their investigation given the apparent escalation toward potential physical intimidation. The board's response came faster than expected, a full inquiry hearing scheduled within 2 weeks. Deborah, meanwhile, seemed to sense the walls closing further still. She began liquidating what appeared to be personal assets. According to Marcus, who nervously kept me updated through Priya, worried Deborah might attempt to move or hide funds before any formal financial audit could properly examine the diverted reserves. Ron finally called me directly this time, voice shaking slightly. "She's talking about leaving town for a while," he admitted. "Says she needs to visit her sister. I don't think that's really what's happening. I think she's scared. Genuinely scared. For the first time since I've known her." I asked Ron if he'd be willing to speak with Priya formally about what he'd observed. After a long, heavy pause, he said yes. "I should have said something years ago," he admitted quietly. "I just kept telling myself it wasn't my place. I don't believe that excuse anymore." Ron's statement, once formalized, added another layer. He described Deborah discussing specific residents by name over dinner, detailing plans to pressure them into paying inflated dues before major life events, treating it almost like a strategy game rather than something affecting real families and real financial stability. The financial audit request moved forward alongside the Oversight Board's inquiry, with a court-appointed forensic accountant now examining 5 years of Meadow Hollow HOA records. Preliminary findings, shared cautiously with Priya, suggested nearly $60,000 in discrepancies between collected dues and documented community expenditures over that period alone. $60,000 was a staggering figure for a modest suburban HOA, and it explained plenty: the persistent, aggressive fine campaigns, the fabricated back dues notices, the pressure tactics against families in vulnerable moments. Deborah hadn't just been controlling for control's sake. She'd been quietly, methodically stealing for years. Farah's investigative piece finally published that week. Detailed and carefully sourced, weaving together the Alvarez family's testimony, Ruth's 6-year notebook, Marcus's whistleblower account, Ron's admission, and the forensic audit's preliminary $60,000 discrepancy. It spread through local social media faster than any of Deborah's own carefully crafted posts ever had. The neighborhood reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Residents who'd quietly paid disputed fines years earlier began reaching out, sharing their own stories, realizing collectively for the first time just how widespread and deliberate the pattern truly was. What had felt isolated suddenly felt like a shared, long-hidden wound finally surfacing. Deborah's social media presence went silent overnight. Her previous defensive posts either deleted or buried under an avalanche of new comments from residents finally speaking freely. I felt something unexpected watching it unfold. Not triumph exactly, but a heavy, complicated relief that the truth had finally started outrunning the fear. The Oversight Board's inquiry hearing arrived, held in a county administrative building rather than the familiar clubhouse, stripped of Deborah's usual home field advantage. Elena Alvarez flew in specifically to testify in person. Ruth brought her original notebook. Marcus and Ron both appeared, visibly nervous but resolved to speak fully. Deborah arrived with her own attorney, composed on the surface but noticeably thinner than I remembered, dark circles evident even under careful makeup. She avoided eye contact with nearly everyone in the room, a stark contrast to the woman who once measured lawns with a ruler and total confidence. The hearing stretched across 2 full days. Testimony after testimony, document after document entered into the record. The forensic accountant presented detailed findings on the diverted reserve account. Priya methodically walked through the fraudulent roster, the ignored easement revocation, and the pattern of pressure tactics against vulnerable families. When it was my turn to testify, I kept my voice steady, focusing on facts rather than emotion, exactly as Priya had coached. I described the fabricated dues notice, the removed mailbox, the slashed tires, the threatening note. I let the documentation, not my anger, carry the weight of it all. Elena's testimony was the hardest to hear, describing the exact moment her family paid $9,200 they never legally owed, terrified of losing their home sale during her mother's medical crisis. Several board members visibly reacted, one wiping her eyes discreetly. The human cost was no longer abstract to anyone present. Deborah's attorney attempted to frame everything as clerical errors and misunderstandings, isolated incidents rather than a coordinated pattern. But Gerald, the board member, calmly countered by reading aloud the meeting minutes from 3 years earlier, the ones formally voting to remove my property from the disputed roster. If it was truly clerical error, Gerald said, looking directly at Deborah for the first time, why did the roster remain unchanged for 3 years after this board explicitly voted otherwise? Why did dues notices continue based on a listing this board formally rejected? Deborah had no immediate answer. The forensic accountant's final report entered into evidence confirmed what everyone increasingly suspected. The diverted reserve funds correlated directly with Deborah's personal expenses over several years,
including the unpermitted sunroom addition I'd noticed months earlier, now formally documented as constructed without required HOA architectural review approval.
The irony landed heavily across the room. The woman who'd fined neighbors over bird baths and rooster mailboxes had built an entire addition to her own.
Home in direct violation of the very rules she'd weaponized against everyone else. Funded partially by dues collected under false, fabricated pretenses.
By the end of the second day, the Oversight Board announced they had heard sufficient evidence to move forward with formal proceedings, including potential removal from HOA leadership, financial restitution requirements, and referral to local law enforcement regarding the fraudulent billing practices and threatening intimidation tactics. Deborah left the hearing without speaking to reporters, her attorney issuing only a brief statement about looking forward to due process. I watched her walk to her car alone, Ron notably absent from her side, and felt none of the satisfaction I'd once imagined this moment might bring. Priya reminded me that formal proceedings still meant weeks, possibly months, before any final resolution, restitution hearings, potential criminal referral review, a special HOA election to replace Deborah's leadership entirely. The paperwork wasn't finished. But the truth, finally, undeniably, was out in the open for good. Rather than accepting the mounting evidence, Deborah grew increasingly desperate in the weeks following the hearing. She began contacting individual board members privately, according to Gerald, pressuring them to soften their testimony or delay the restitution proceedings, hinting vaguely at consequences for those who continued cooperating against her. Gerald reported the pressure attempts directly to the Oversight Board and to Priya, adding witness tampering concerns to an already substantial case file. What had started as a dispute over a mailbox and a fabricated roster had evolved into something far more serious, with real legal weight behind it. Deborah's desperation escalated further when she attempted to quietly transfer ownership of her house, sunroom addition and all, to a relative out of state, apparently hoping to shield the property from potential restitution judgments. The forensic accountant flagged the transfer attempt immediately, and the court froze the transaction. I learned about the attempted transfer through Priya, who explained it as a classic sign of someone realizing their financial exposure was far more serious than they'd initially calculated. People don't try to hide assets over misunderstandings, Priya said.
They do it when they know.
Around this time, Deborah showed up at my house again, unannounced, for the first time since the hearing began. Gone was the clipboard and rehearsed authority. She looked genuinely desperate, almost pleading. "You don't understand what this will do to me," she said. "Please, just drop your complaint." I told her clearly, calmly, that this was no longer just about me. It was about Elena's family, about Ruth's 6 years of silence, about Marcus's fear, about every resident who'd paid fines they never owed. "This stopped being personal a long time ago," I said. She had no response. Deborah's tone shifted from pleading to something colder within minutes. "You'll regret pushing this," she said quietly, before walking back to her car. I recorded the entire exchange on my phone, per habit now, and sent it directly to Priya and Officer Reyes that same evening without hesitation. Officer Reyes flagged the comment as a potential additional threat, adding it to the growing case file alongside the earlier note and the slashed tires. "She's not thinking clearly anymore," he told me. "People who feel cornered sometimes do things that make their situation dramatically worse than it already is." 2 nights later, my home security camera, newly installed after the earlier threat, captured someone approaching my grandfather's garden shed around 2 a.m., attempting to pry open the door before apparently losing nerve and fleeing into the darkness. The build matched Deborah's, though the footage remained frustratingly imperfect again. I called Officer Reyes immediately, and this time, combined with everything else already documented, It was enough for local law enforcement to formally interview Deborah directly regarding a pattern of escalating behavior toward me specifically. She denied everything, but her alibi for that exact time frame proved notably inconsistent. Marcus, still cooperating fully, revealed something new during this period. Deborah had once mentioned, offhandedly, wanting to know exactly what was stored in my grandfather's old shed. Convinced I was hiding something incriminating there related to the property dispute. It explained, disturbingly, the attempted break-in months later. What Deborah didn't know, and what I hadn't publicly revealed yet, was that the shed contained nothing incriminating at all. Just my grandfather's old tools and gardening equipment. Her paranoia about hidden evidence had driven her toward increasingly reckless, self-destructive behavior that only strengthened the case against her further. The restitution hearing date finally arrived. Moved up given the escalating concerns around witness tampering and the attempted property transfer. Elena flew back in again. Ruth sat beside me this time, notebook still in hand, no longer hidden away in a kitchen drawer but proudly. Finally, part of the official record. Deborah arrived without her previous composure entirely gone. Visibly thinner, her attorney doing most of the talking now. The forensic accountant's final restitution calculation came to $71,400 across all affected households, plus the diverted reserve funds, plus mandated removal from any future HOA leadership position anywhere in the state. The board also formally referred the case to the County District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal fraud charges. Given the scale and clear intentionality of the diverted funds and fabricated billing scheme, Deborah's attorney requested a continuance to prepare a defense. The board granted a brief one. During the continuance period, Deborah's behavior grew increasingly erratic according to multiple neighbors. She was seen arguing loudly with Ron in their driveway, packing boxes into her car late at night, and according to Curtis, making increasingly wild claims to anyone who'd listen about being set up by everyone. Ron finally moved out during this period, staying temporarily with his brother across town, unwilling to remain in a house funded partially by money that legally belonged to families like Elena's. He reached out to me once more, briefly, simply writing, "I'm sorry it took me this long to do something." I didn't hold on to anger toward Ron specifically. He'd eventually chosen to help, even if belatedly, even if fear had kept him silent for years before that. Priya reminded me gently that people process complicity differently, and Ron's cooperation, however delayed, had genuinely strengthened our case in meaningful ways. Deborah, increasingly isolated, made one final desperate attempt. She filed a countersuit against me personally, alleging harassment, defamation, and emotional distress, seeking damages that seemed almost designed purely to intimidate rather than any genuine expectation of success given the mountain of evidence already stacked firmly against her. Priya wasn't concerned, she said confidently. Courts see through retaliatory countersuits fairly quickly, especially ones filed after a party's own documented fraud has already been substantiated through forensic accounting and formal board proceedings. This won't hold up under any real scrutiny. The countersuit was dismissed within 3 weeks, the judge noting explicitly in her written ruling that it appeared retaliatory in nature, lacking substantive legal basis, and filed in apparent response to legitimate whistleblower cooperation with an ongoing oversight investigation. Deborah's legal fees, meanwhile, continued mounting with each failed maneuver. Farah published a follow-up piece detailing the dismissed countersuit, the criminal referral, and the mounting restitution figures, noting the broader pattern emerging across several HOA communities in the region facing similar scrutiny after her original reporting inspired other journalists to investigate comparable situations elsewhere in the state. I received messages from residents in entirely different neighborhoods, some states away, describing eerily similar experiences with their own HOA leadership, fabricated dues, selective enforcement, intimidation tactics against those who questioned authority. Deborah's story had become, unintentionally, a catalyst for scrutiny far beyond just Meadow Hollow estates. The county district attorney's office formally announced they were pursuing fraud charges against Deborah, citing the forensic accounting evidence, Marcus's whistleblower testimony, Elena's documented payment under duress, and the pattern established through Ruth's 6-year notebook. The charges carried the possibility of significant fines and potential jail time. Deborah's attorney negotiated for a plea arrangement rather than risk trial given the overwhelming evidence, though the specific terms remained under negotiation for weeks. Meanwhile, the HOA board scheduled a special election to replace her leadership entirely. The first genuinely contested HOA presidency race Meadow Hollow had seen in over a decade. Gerald announced his candidacy for HOA president, running on a platform of transparent financial reporting and independent audits, a stark contrast to over a decade of unquestioned authority. Ruth, somewhat to her own surprise, agreed to join the board as treasurer, determined that her notebook's lessons wouldn't be forgotten. I attended the special election meeting, this time genuinely welcomed rather than tolerated, watching residents openly discuss accountability and transparency in ways that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Curtis leaned over during the vote count and said quietly, "Feels different in here now, doesn't it?" It did feel different. The laminated notices, the quiet fear that had governed Meadow Hollow for over a decade, had finally cracked open under the simple, persistent weight of documentation, courage, and people finally willing to speak when someone else went first and proved it was survivable. Deborah's plea deal eventually finalized. Guilty to fraud charges related to the diverted reserve funds, mandatory restitution payments structured over several years, a permanent ban from serving in any HOA leadership capacity statewide, and a suspended jail sentence contingent on full compliance with the restitution schedule moving forward. Some residents felt the suspended sentence was too lenient given everything she'd done over the years. I understood the frustration, but Priya reminded me that the restitution, the public accountability, the permanent leadership ban, and the complete unraveling of the fear she'd built represented genuine, substantial consequences regardless. Elena called when the plea deal finalized, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. "I never thought anyone would actually believe us," she admitted. "We just quietly paid and left, assuming that's how these things always go. You changed that. Together." Marcus reached out one final time before largely stepping back from the neighborhood entirely, moving to a different town for a fresh start. "I couldn't have done it alone," he wrote. "I was too scared enough to finally tell the truth. I saved that message." Ron eventually filed for divorce, finalizing what had clearly been eroding for years beneath the surface of their carefully curated Meadow Hollow life. He sent one last brief note wishing me well, admitting he was relieved, in a complicated way, that everything had finally, fully come apart into the open. Deborah put her house up for sale not long after the plea deal. The unpermitted sunroom addition now requiring costly retroactive permitting before any sale could legally proceed. An ironic final indignity given how many neighbors she'd once fined over far smaller, far less significant violations of her own strict rulebook. I watched the moving truck from my porch one afternoon, feeling something quieter than triumph settle over me instead. A kind of tired, hard-won peace. My grandfather's land, the very thing she'd tried to claim didn't belong to me, had ultimately outlasted her entire carefully constructed decade of quiet control. Curtis stopped by that same afternoon, watching the truck pull away with me in comfortable silence for a while before finally speaking. "You know," he said, "most people would have just paid the fake dues and moved on like everyone else did for years. Glad you didn't." In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood settled into an unfamiliar but welcome rhythm. Transparent board meetings, published financial statements, an actual functioning suggestion process rather than unilateral decree. Gerald, now officially president, made a point of publicly thanking Ruth's notebook during his first formal address to residents. I finally finished unpacking the last of my moving boxes around this time, months later than planned, life having been consumed almost entirely by documentation, hearings, and quiet strategic phone calls with Priya. Felt strange, almost unfamiliar, to simply exist in my grandfather's house without an active battle unfolding. Priya called with one final piece of news. The restitution fund, once fully collected, would be distributed proportionally among all affected households, including Elena's family and several others who'd come forward during the investigation. It wouldn't undo the stress and fear they'd endured, but it was something concrete. Finally, I used part of my own restitution amount, modest compared to what Elena's family received, to formally restore the road easement area to its original, legally documented condition, planting native grasses my grandfather had always preferred over the manicured HOA standard lawns Deborah once measured with her small metal ruler. Ruth brought over a new birdbath as a housewarming gift, laughing as she set it near my porch steps. "Figured you'd appreciate the irony," she said. It sat there through the following seasons without a single laminated notice ever appearing. A small, quiet symbol of everything that had finally changed. Elena visited eventually, flying in specifically to see the neighborhood that had caused her family so much stress years earlier, curious to witness its transformation firsthand. We walked the street together, past the clubhouse where Gerald now held genuinely open meetings, past Deborah's old house, now occupied by a new family entirely. "It's strange," Elena said, looking at the house that once represented so much fear for her family. "It's just a house now. Just wood and brick. So much bigger than that for so long." I understood exactly what she meant, having felt it too. I thought often, in the months that followed, about how close I'd come to simply paying that fabricated $14,600 lien out of exhaustion and fear, the way Elena's family once had, the way likely several other unnamed families had before either of us ever arrived in Meadow Hollow Estates. What had stopped me wasn't bravery exactly, though people kept calling it that. It was simpler. A filing cabinet full of my grandfather's meticulous records, a stubborn refusal to accept something that didn't add up, and eventually, crucially, other people finally willing to add their own quiet truths to mine. Farah's original investigative piece went on to win a regional journalism award months later. cited specifically for exposing systemic HOA financial abuse patterns that extended well beyond just one neighborhood or one particularly controlling woman with a laminated rulebook and an unchecked decade of quiet, accumulated authority. I attended the award ceremony at Farah's invitation, sitting beside Elena, Ruth, and even Marcus, who'd driven back for the occasion despite his fresh start elsewhere. It felt less like celebrating a scandal and more like acknowledging, collectively, how much courage it had actually taken each of us to speak. Gerald's transparent leadership approach inspired several other regional HOAs to voluntarily adopt similar independent audit practices, partly out of genuine reform, partly, Priya suspected Riley, out of boards suddenly nervous about what forensic accountants might uncover in their own long unexamined reserve accounts and dues collection histories. My grandfather's old filing cabinet, the one I'd almost left untouched in a corner for months, became something of a personal reminder rather than just storage. I kept Ruth's notebook copy inside it now too, alongside the original deed, a quiet archive of exactly how much documentation had ultimately mattered. Deborah, according to occasional updates from Ron before he eventually stopped reaching out entirely, moved to a small apartment in a different county, working an ordinary retail job, her name apparently unrecognizable to new coworkers who had no idea about laminated rulebooks or clipboard authority or measured lawns. I never sought her out, never confirmed those updates independently, and eventually stopped wondering much about her at all. The restitution payments continued arriving on schedule according to Priya's periodic updates. Steady and unremarkable, exactly the way accountability was supposed to feel once the drama had finally, fully settled. Curtis and I became genuine friends over that following year, occasionally grilling together on weekends, his kids eventually calling me the Rooster Lady, affectionately, a nickname referencing the mailbox that had started the entire unraveling months earlier. My grandfather, I suspected, would have found that particular detail deeply amusing. Ruth continued serving as treasurer, becoming something of a quiet local legend for the notebook that had sat in her kitchen drawer for 6 patient, watchful years before finally finding its purpose. She told me once that she'd almost thrown it away a dozen times, never quite able to. I think part of me always knew someone would need it eventually, Ruth admitted one evening on my porch, the restored birdbath catching the last of the sunset light. I just didn't know it would be a rooster mailbox and a stubborn woman who actually read her grandfather's old files. I planted a small rose garden that sprang near where the original mailbox once stood. The new one considerably sturdier. No laminated notice threatening its removal anymore. My grandfather had loved roses. I remembered another small detail I hadn't known until finally reading through his careful, patient old letters. The neighborhood itself felt lighter somehow, in ways harder to quantify than fine amounts or restitution figures. People waved more, lingered in driveways longer, organized a genuine, voluntary community barbecue that summer without a single mandatory dues notice attached to the invitation. Felt, finally, like an actual neighborhood. I thought about the Alvarez family's original silent departure often. How close their story had come to simply disappearing into the same quiet fear that had swallowed so many complaints before mine. Elena and I stayed in touch regularly afterward, an unlikely friendship born from shared, hard-won vindication. On the 1-year anniversary of the day Deborah had first banged on my door over an unauthorized mailbox rooster, I sat on my porch with Ruth, Curtis, and Elena, who'd flown in specifically for the occasion. All of us laughing about how absurd and how serious that beginning had actually been. "To rooster mailboxes," Curtis said, raising his glass with a grin, "and stubborn women who read their grandfather's paperwork." We toasted, laughter echoing across a yard that had once felt like a battlefield and now, finally, simply felt like home again, exactly the way it should have all along. I still keep my grandfather's original filing cabinet in the study, untouched otherwise, a quiet monument to the fact that patience, documentation, and a refusal to simply pay fear's asking price had ultimately outlasted a decade of quiet, unchecked authority nobody had ever thought to properly question before. Priya closed our case file formally that same week. Restitution fully collected. Deborah's leadership ban permanent statewide. Gerald's transparent board thriving into its second full year. "Some cases end quietly," she told me over our final phone call. "This one earned a little noise. Enjoy it." I thought, often in quieter moments, about how differently everything might have unfolded if I'd simply paid that fabricated lien out of exhaustion. The way it seemed designed for me to do. The way it had clearly worked on families before mine who'd never had a filing cabinet full of proof. The lesson, I came to believe, wasn't really about mailboxes or HOAs specifically. It was about how quietly, gradually, unchecked authority convinces people that questioning it is more dangerous than simply complying, until eventually someone, anyone, decides the questions matter more than the fear of asking them out loud. My grandfather, I like to think, would have approved of exactly how this had all unfolded: methodical, patient, built on paperwork and truth rather than anger or spectacle. Even if the spectacle had ultimately, satisfyingly, found its own way into the story anyway, whether either of us had planned it or not. As I write this final entry into what's become an unofficial record of everything, I glance out at the rose garden, the sturdy new mailbox, the quiet street that no longer flinches at the sound of an approaching clipboard. It took one impossible question to unravel everything, and I finally asked it. The morning it all truly broke wide open began ordinarily enough. Sunlight cutting through the kitchen window as I sipped coffee, unaware that Deborah, freshly served with her formal fraud charges the previous evening, had decided against quietly accepting the situation, choosing instead one final, desperate confrontation. She arrived at my door before 8, disheveled in a way I'd genuinely never seen, dark circles pronounced, voice raw. "You did this?" she said immediately. No greeting, no pretense of civility remaining. 15 years I built this community, and you tore it apart over a mailbox and a grudge. I stayed calm. Deliberately, the way Priya and months of documentation had trained me to. "I didn't build the fraud," I said quietly. "I didn't fabricate the roster or steal from Elena's family or threaten anyone. You did that long before I ever moved back here. I just asked questions." Deborah's composure cracked entirely then, something raw and furious replacing the calculated authority I'd known for months. "You have no idea what it takes to run something like this," she snapped. "The complaints, the entitled residents, the constant demands. I kept this neighborhood together. Nobody appreciated what that actually cost me." "You kept it together through fear," I said, "and fraud, and fabricated dues that stole thousands from families who trusted you." She She stepped closer, voice rising now, loud enough that Curtis, working in his yard next door, straightened up and started walking toward us, phone already visible in his hand. "You think you're better than me," Deborah said. "Coming back here with your inherited land and your lawyer and your paperwork. I built my position. I had. And you tore it down for what? A principle and real power." "I understand real power just fine," I said. "It's the power you had over people too scared to question you. Real power isn't fear, Deborah. It's the truth finally being stronger than the story you told yourself for over a decade." Her hands were visibly shaking now, entirely unlike her. Curtis reached the edge of my yard just as Deborah's voice cracked into something almost desperate. "I have nothing left," she said. "The house, my marriage, everything. Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand what it feels like to lose absolutely everything you spent your entire life building?" "I understand exactly what that feels like," I said, thinking of Elena's family, of Ruth's 6 silent years, of Marcus's fear, of every neighbor who'd quietly paid dues they never owed because losing felt safer than fighting. The difference is, they lost everything because of choices you made deliberately. Deborah stared at me for a long, silent moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Not quite regret, not quite acceptance, something more complicated than either. "I never thought anyone would actually check," she finally admitted, voice barely audible now. "Nobody ever checked before. Not once. In 11 years. That admission, quiet and involuntary, landed heavier than anything else she'd said all morning. Curtis, standing beside me now, had his phone recording discreetly, capturing the moment Deborah Sinclair finally, fully acknowledged what everyone had already proven through months of documentation, testimony, and forensic accounting. She had known exactly what she was doing. "Why me?" I asked, genuinely curious despite everything. "Why not just leave my grandfather's property alone, once you realized it wasn't actually in the HOA?" Deborah laughed, short and bitter. "Because letting one property stay independent meant admitting the entire system I'd built could be questioned. I couldn't allow that. It was the closest thing to a full confession I'd get. Delivered not in a courtroom but standing on my own porch. Months of careful documentation finally colliding with the simple, human moment of someone forced to see their own choices clearly for what felt like the very first time. Officer Reyes arrived minutes later, called by Curtis the moment the confrontation had started escalating. Standard protocol given everything already on file regarding Deborah's prior behavior. He spoke with her calmly but firmly, noting the unsolicited visit violated the terms of an informal distance agreement Priya had arranged weeks earlier. Deborah didn't resist, seeming almost deflated by that point. Whatever fight had driven her to my door that morning apparently exhausted alongside everything else she'd lost. She got back into her car quietly, and I watched her drive away for what would turn out to be the final time I ever saw her. Curtis's recording, combined with Officer Reyes's incident report, became part of the formal record supporting the violation of the distance agreement, adding one final documented incident to a case file that had grown, almost unbelievably, from a single laminated mailbox notice into a comprehensive record of systemic fraud and harassment. Priya used the incident to secure a formal restraining order, ensuring Deborah couldn't approach my property or attempt contact again during the remainder of the ongoing legal proceedings. This should have happened months ago, Priya said, reviewing the paperwork. But better now than not at all. You're protected properly now. I sat on my porch steps after everyone had left, hands still slightly unsteady from the confrontation, processing the strange mixture of vindication and exhaustion that came with finally hearing someone admit, out loud, exactly what they'd done and exactly why they'd believed they could get away with it. Ruth came over that evening, having heard about the confrontation through the neighborhood's rapidly efficient grapevine, bringing banana bread as always, sitting quietly beside me without demanding conversation. Sometimes, I was learning, the most meaningful support looked less like words and more like simply, steadily, showing up. 11 years, Ruth finally said, breaking the comfortable silence. 11 years of nobody checking. It's almost unbelievable when you say it out loud like that. I nodded, thinking of my grandfather's careful, patient filing cabinet, of how close that particular decade might have stretched into an entirely uncounted 12th year. The following week brought the criminal case formally to court. No longer just an HOA oversight matter, but a full legal proceeding with real, serious stakes attached. Deborah's attorney continued negotiating terms, but the confession-adjacent statement she'd made on my porch, now part of the official record, significantly weakened any remaining defense. I testified again, this time in a proper courtroom rather than an administrative hearing room, describing the entire unraveling from the very first laminated mailbox notice through the porch confrontation months later. The judge listened carefully, occasionally taking notes, clearly building a comprehensive understanding of the case's full scope. Elena testified as well, her voice steadier this time than during the earlier oversight hearing, describing not just the financial harm but the fear, the sleepless nights, the feeling of being powerless against someone who wielded a rulebook like a weapon disguised as community order and shared neighborhood standards. Marcus's whistleblower testimony proved particularly damaging to Deborah's defense, detailing specific instances of ledger manipulation he'd personally witnessed, time-stamped and cross-referenced against the forensic accountant's independent findings. His nervousness had transformed, over the months, into a quiet, steady resolve I genuinely admired watching unfold in that courtroom. Ron testified last among the key witnesses, visibly uncomfortable but resolute, describing the dinner table conversations where Deborah had discussed pressuring specific families by name. I should have said something years earlier, he told the court plainly. I'm saying it now because it's finally, actually the right thing to do. Deborah's attorney attempted one final defense strategy, arguing diminished culpability due to the stress of unpaid, thankless community leadership, suggesting the diverted funds had been intended for eventual community benefit rather than personal enrichment. The forensic accountant's detailed spending breakdown, however, told an entirely different, far more specific story. The judge, reviewing the Sunroom Edition's construction timeline alongside the reserve account withdrawal records, noted dryly in her ruling that personal home renovations do not typically qualify as deferred community infrastructure investments, a line that made even the courtroom stenographer visibly suppress a small, involuntary smile. The formal sentencing hearing arrived several weeks later. Courtroom fuller than any previous proceeding. Word having spread widely throughout not just Meadow Hollow but several neighboring communities following Farah's extensive coverage. Elena, Ruth, Marcus, Curtis, and even Gerald attended. A quiet show of collective solidarity months in the making. The judge acknowledged the full restitution amount, now finalized at $74,800 across all affected households, the permanent statewide leadership ban, and Deborah's guilty plea, but also emphasized the pattern of witness intimidation and the attempted asset transfer as aggravating factors weighing significantly against any particularly lenient consideration. Deborah addressed the court briefly before sentencing, her voice steady but noticeably diminished from the commanding presence she'd once carried through Meadow Hollow's clubhouse meetings. "I convinced myself I was protecting something," she said. "I understand now I was only ever protecting my own need for control. I am sorry, whether the apology was genuine or strategic. I couldn't fully know. And honestly, by that point, it mattered less to me than I might have expected months earlier. The restitution was finalized. The truth was fully documented. The fear that had governed Meadow Hollow for over a decade had been thoroughly, permanently broken." The judge handed down the sentence. Full restitution payments structured over 4 years, 500 hours of community service unrelated to any HOA capacity, 3 years of probation, and formal confirmation of the permanent statewide ban from serving in any homeowners association leadership role, effective immediately and irreversibly. The suspended jail sentence remained contingent entirely on strict compliance with every term, meaning any missed restitution payment or probation violation would trigger immediate incarceration. Priya considered it a genuinely appropriate outcome given the scale of harm, balanced against Deborah's full cooperation once the case had become undeniable. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, Farah among them, though she'd already published her definitive account weeks earlier and mostly observed now rather than actively reported. Elena squeezed my hand as we walked down the courthouse steps together, both of us finally, fully exhaling after months of accumulated tension. "It's really over," Elena said, sounding almost surprised to hear herself say it aloud. I nodded, though I understood by then that over was a complicated word, that some kinds of accountability took years to fully unfold even after a judge's gavel had technically, legally closed the formal case. Ruth hugged me tightly on the courthouse steps. Her notebook, now formally entered into permanent court record, having traveled further than she'd ever imagined it would when she first started quietly writing down dates and incidents at her kitchen table years before I'd ever moved back to Meadow Hollow. Curtis clapped me on the shoulder, grinning in a way that felt genuinely lighter than I'd seen from him in months. "Rooster Lady wins," he said, and despite everything serious about the day, I laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in longer than I could easily remember. Marcus stood slightly apart from the group, still adjusting to being publicly associated with the case rather than quietly, anxiously working behind the scenes. I walked over and thanked him directly, one more time, for the courage it had taken to knock on my door that nervous evening months earlier. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my responsibility to fix. But watching you keep asking questions when everyone else stayed quiet, it made staying quiet feel like its own kind of choice. I didn't want to keep making that particular choice anymore." Gerald addressed the small gathered group briefly, formally announcing that the HOA board intended to establish a modest annual scholarship fund using a portion of unclaimed restitution interest, named quietly in honor of residents who chose transparency over silence, without ever needing to specify whose story had inspired it. I drove home that afternoon along the same streets Deborah had once patrolled with her measuring ruler and laminated notices, past the clubhouse now hosting genuinely open community meetings, Past Ruth's house with its wind chimes, past Curtis's yard, finally turning into my own driveway beneath the late afternoon sun. The rose garden had bloomed fully by then, the sturdy new mailbox standing exactly where the old rooster once had, no laminated threats taped anywhere near it. I sat on the porch steps for a long while, simply existing in the quiet, no longer bracing for the next confrontation or notice. My phone buzzed with a message from Priya. Brief and characteristically professional. Case officially closed on our end. Well done, Grace. Your grandfather would be proud of how methodically you handled all of this. I read it twice, feeling something settle deep in my chest that had been unsettled for months. I thought about my grandfather often in the days following sentencing, wondering what he'd have made of the entire saga, imagining him nodding approvingly at the careful documentation, the patient building of a case, the refusal to simply pay fears asking price the way so many others had before me. Elena called a week later with unexpected news. Several other families from her old research into similar HOA fraud cases across the region had reached out, inspired by Farah's coverage, forming an informal support network for residents facing comparable intimidation elsewhere. You started something bigger than either of us realized, she said. I hadn't set out to start a movement, hadn't imagined my grandfather's old rooster mailbox would eventually connect strangers across several states, all quietly discovering they weren't alone in what they'd experienced. But truth, once it finally found room to breathe, apparently had a way of traveling further than expected. Ron reached out one final time that summer, briefly, letting me know he'd relocated permanently, started attending therapy, and was slowly rebuilding a life separate from everything Meadow Hollow had once represented for him. I hope you know, he wrote, that speaking up mattered more than I can properly express. Deborah began her community service that fall. According to occasional updates through the formal restitution monitoring process Priya still tracked periodically. She reportedly worked with a local food bank. A strange, quiet irony given how selectively she'd once distributed fairness within her own tightly controlled little kingdom of rules. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that particular detail. Exactly. But I did feel something like closure. The sense that consequences, real and structured and monitored, had finally replaced the fear that once organized every interaction on this street for over a decade under her careful, controlling watch. The neighborhood held its first genuinely democratic annual meeting that autumn. Financial statements projected openly on a screen. Questions welcomed rather than punished. Gerald patiently walking residents through budget line items nobody had ever previously been allowed to see or seriously question during Deborah's entire, unchallenged tenure. I attended, sitting beside Ruth and Curtis, watching new residents ask ordinary questions about landscaping budgets and pool maintenance schedules with a casualness that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Felt, finally, like an actual community rather than a fiefdom governed by fear and a laminated rulebook. Farah stopped by unannounced one afternoon that winter, working on a longer-form piece about the broader HOA accountability movement her original reporting had inadvertently sparked. Any regrets? She asked. Notebook ready. I thought about it honestly before answering.
Only that it took someone questioning.
The restitution payments continued arriving steadily according to Priya's periodic updates. Elena's family fully compensated within the first year. Ruth and the other affected households following close behind. The financial harm, at least, had a clear, measurable resolution. even if the years of accumulated fear couldn't be quite so neatly repaid. Meadow Hollow itself changed gradually but unmistakably. Fewer fines, more genuine conversation. A community garden Gerald's board approved unanimously in its very first transparent budget session. Planted with vegetables residents actually wanted rather than the strictly regulated ornamental hedges Deborah had once mandated across every single front yard. I still owned the land, still lived quietly on my grandfather's 11 acres, the mailbox rooster's sturdier replacement standing proudly at the end of my driveway. The HOA, properly understood now, had never actually held authority over my grandfather's property at all, not for one single day of that entire decade. That simple, foundational truth, buried for years in an old filing cabinet nobody had thought to open, had ultimately unraveled everything. The fraud, the fear, the fabricated dues, the decade of quiet, unquestioned control. Sometimes the truth waits patiently, exactly like my grandfather had, for someone finally willing to look. People still call me the Rooster Lady around town, a nickname I've grown genuinely fond of, a reminder of exactly how something so small, a wooden bird on a mailbox, had eventually exposed something so significant hiding in plain sight for over a decade of quiet suburban silence. I sit on my porch most evenings now, rose garden blooming, birdbath catching the last light, watching a neighborhood slowly remember what it felt like to exist without fear organizing every quiet decision. My grandfather's land held firm through it all, exactly as he'd always intended it to. Some victories arrive loud and immediate. This one arrived slow, patient, built from paperwork and courage and neighbors finally willing to speak once someone else went first. I never set out to dismantle anything. I only ever asked one simple, stubborn question, and refused to accept silence as the answer. Deborah Sinclair no longer measures anyone's lawn with a small metal ruler. My grandfather's rooster mailbox, in spirit if not in original form, still stands. And Meadow Hollow, finally, quietly, belongs to the people who actually live there. The END.